The cold morning air bit through Oberleutnant Klaus Richter's flight jacket as he stood on the concrete apron of Juvincourt airfield, sipping bitter ersatz coffee from a tin mug. November 7, 1944. The eastern sky bled crimson over the snow-dusted fields of northern France, a dawn that felt more like a funeral pyre than a new day. At 24 years old, Richter already carried the weary posture of a man who had seen too much war, his face prematurely lined beneath the crisp peak of his officer's cap. 48 confirmed kills painted in neat black swastikas below his cockpit, each one a story of fire and falling metal, each one proof of German aerial supremacy. Through the morning mist, the mechanics swarmed over his Focke-Wulf FW-190D-9, the long-nose Doras that had become the last, best hope of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. The sleek, deadly shape never failed to stir something primal in him, that perfect marriage of man and machine that had made him an ace 3 times over. The BMW 801 radial engine, now being warmed up, throbbed with 18.0 horsepower of raw German engineering. It was a Predator's heartbeat. His wingman, Unteroffizier Erich Vogel, just 19, still pink-cheeked and bright-eyed, came trotting up, breath pluming in the frigid air. "Another day hunting Amis, Herr Oberleutnant," Vogel said, that familiar cocky grin plastered across his face. "I heard intelligence reports more of their jabos are crossing the Rhine. More target practice, yes." Richter allowed himself a thin smile. Young Vogel reminded him of himself 2 years ago, when the war still felt like a grand adventure rather than a slow, grinding defeat. "Perhaps, Vogel. But remember, even cornered rats will bite." He finished his coffee, the gritty ground sticking to his tongue. "The Americans learn eventually. They always learn." Vogel waved a dismissive hand. "Their Thunderbolts are flying tanks, slow, clumsy. And those new Mustangs." He shook his head. "Pretty, but no match for our Doras in a turning fight. We'll send them home in pieces, just like always." Richter didn't answer, his eyes scanning the horizon where contrails were already beginning to scratch the pale blue sky. Something had shifted in the air war these past months, something he couldn't quite quantify. The Americans weren't just throwing masses of bombers at them anymore, they were getting smarter, more aggressive. And their fighters, there were rumors, whispers in pilot briefings about encounters that didn't make sense, performances that defied physics. He pushed the thoughts away. Superstition had no place in the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf. What neither man knew, what no German intelligence report had accurately captured, was that while they stood shivering on that French airfield, American factories across the Atlantic were achieving something that would have been dismissed as pure fantasy in Berlin's war ministries. In Buffalo, New York, Republic Aviation's production lines were churning out not dozens, but hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts every month, each one equipped with a technological marvel that would soon render the Luftwaffe's tactical advantages obsolete. And in the briefing rooms of the 56th Fighter Group at Boxted, young American pilots were studying maps of the very airspace where Richter and Vogel would fly that day, preparing to unleash a tactical revolution that would change air combat forever. The briefing that morning at Juvincourt had been typically confident, typically German in its precision and its profound miscalculation. Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt, their Gruppekommandeur, had stood before the map of Western Europe with his pointer stick, tracing expected American flight paths. "Intelligence confirms the Amis are sending 2 boxes of B-17 toward the synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg," he'd said, the stick tapping against the map. "Escort will likely be P-51s from the 4th Fighter Group, excellent high-altitude performance, but we have the advantage below 20,000 feet." Richter had studied the intelligence estimates with a professional's eye. According to the reports on his clipboard, the Americans could maintain approximately 400 fighters over Germany on any given day, a formidable number, but one the Luftwaffe believed it could handle through superior tactics and pilot quality. The reports were precise, detailed, and catastrophically wrong. They failed to account for the fact that American production had not just increased, but exploded, that for every German pilot who took off, 3 newly trained Americans were waiting. The intelligence was dated October 1944, but failed to mention that November would see the highest Allied fighter sortie rates of the entire war. The cultural blinders were equally significant. German pilots, products of a military tradition that valued individual excellence and knightly combat, tended to dismiss American pilots as bus drivers, competent but uncreative, reliant on brute force rather than finesse. This prejudice ran so deep that when captured American pilots described their training methods, the standardized procedures, the emphasis on formation flying and energy conservation, German interrogators often assumed they were being fed disinformation. The concept that America's true weapon wasn't better pilots, but a system that could produce adequate pilots in unlimited numbers, was alien to the German military mind. Richter himself had fallen victim to this thinking. In his logbook, he'd meticulously recorded each engagement, analyzing his tactics and his opponents. The Americans, he'd noted, tended to make the same mistakes. They'd waste energy in extravagant maneuvers, break formation too early, fail to support each other in the lethal dance of the dogfight. What he hadn't recorded because he hadn't recognized it was the slow, steady improvement in American performance. Each month the mistakes became fewer. Each engagement the coordination became tighter. Like a glacier moving imperceptibly but irresistibly, American tactical doctrine was evolving, adapting, learning from every loss. There were voices of caution, of course. Oberleutnant Walter Dahl, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders, had circulated a memo just the previous week warning about changes in American fighter tactics. The enemy has abandoned his previous rigid formations in favor of more flexible, mutually supporting elements, Dahl wrote. Their aircraft performance, particularly at altitude, exceeds our previous estimates. We must adapt our tactics accordingly or face unacceptable losses. The memo had been acknowledged, filed, and largely ignored by a high command still fighting the air war of 1943. As Richter climbed into the cockpit of his FW-190, his mechanic handed him a small, grease-stained component. "The new hydraulic boost for the ailerons, Herr Oberleutnant," the man said proudly. "Should give you better roll rate at high speed." Richter nodded his thanks, turning the beautifully machined piece in his hand. German engineering at its finest, an elegant solution to a complex problem. What he couldn't know was that while German factories were producing exquisite, hand-fitted masterpieces, American factories were producing something far more terrifying: consistency. Where each FW-190 had its own quirks and characteristics, each P-47 rolling off Republic's production line was virtually identical, its performance predictable, its systems interchangeable. This standardization, so mundane on the surface, was about to become a decisive advantage. The numbers would have stunned Richter had he known them. While German aircraft production struggled under relentless bombing, American factories were hitting peaks that defied imagination. In October 1944 alone, Republic Aviation produced 324 P-47s, more than the entire German fighter production for that month. The Pratt & Whitney plant in Connecticut was manufacturing R-2,800 engines at a rate of 25-0 per month, each one a twin-row, 18-cylinder masterpiece producing 2,000 horsepower. And in farming towns across America, training fields were graduating 3,000 new pilots every month, more than the Luftwaffe had in its entire fighter arm. But the real revolution, the one that would shock German pilots like Richter to their core, wasn't just in numbers or even in basic aircraft performance. It was in a technological innovation so seemingly minor that German intelligence had largely ignored it: the paddle blade propeller. While German engineers focused on radical advances like jet engines and rocket planes, American engineers had made a simple but profound improvement to the P-47's existing design. The new Curtiss electric propellers, with their broad, curved blades, increased the Thunderbolt's rate of climb by 900 feet per minute and improved its high-altitude performance dramatically. Combined with water injection that provided brief bursts of emergency power, the new P-47s could now match or exceed the performance of German fighters at virtually every altitude. The man responsible for this transformation, Republic's chief engineer Alexander Kartveli, had fought his own battles against American skeptics. "They called my Thunderbolt the Jug, short for Juggernaut, but meaning it flew like a milk jug," Kartveli would later recall. "But when we added the paddle blades and the water injection, we created a different aircraft entirely." The Germans were still fighting the P-47 of 1943. They had no idea what was coming. As Richter settled into his cockpit, the familiar smells of leather, oil, and cold metal filling his nostrils, he went through his pre-flight ritual with automatic precision. Check instruments, test controls, verify radio function. The routine was comforting, a moment of order in the gathering chaos of Germany's collapsing defenses. Through his canopy, he watched Vogel giving his own FW-190 a final walk-around, the young pilot's movements brisk and confident. They were the masters of the sky, these German aces. They had to believe that. The alternative was unthinkable. What happened next would begin as a routine interception and end as a tactical revelation that would ripple through the Luftwaffe for the remaining months of the war. At 8:47 German time, radar stations along the front began reporting large formations crossing into German airspace. The estimates seemed improbable, over 800 bombers, with fighter escort estimated at 300 aircraft. The controllers assumed equipment malfunction or Allied deception. The Americans simply didn't have that many fighters available, not with their other commitments. The reports were checked, rechecked, and finally accepted with growing unease. Richter's group of 28 FW-190s lifted off from Juvincourt at 9:12, climbing steadily eastward toward the reported enemy position. The morning sun glinted off their canopies, the BMW engines purring with smooth, confident power. In Richter's headphones, the chatter was light, professional. These men had done this dozens, some of them hundreds of times. They knew the dance. "Yellow 2, maintain position," Richter said into his oxygen mask, watching Vogel's aircraft drift slightly out of formation. "Jowl, Herr Oberleutnant," came the crisp reply. "Just getting comfortable." Richter scanned the sky ahead, his eyes automatically searching for the telltale contrails that would mark the American formations. At 25,000 feet, the air was bitterly cold, the world below reduced to a patchwork of brown and white. France stretched out like a map, the winding silver thread of the Meuse River visible to the north. Somewhere down there, German troops were fighting and dying, depending on the men in these cockpits to keep the jabos off their backs. The first radio call came at 9:31. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," called out Lieutenant Hartmann from Yellow Flight. "Many bandits." Richter squinted, his hand coming up to shield his eyes from the glare. There they were, tiny specks glinting in the sun, trailing white plumes across the blue. B-17s, hundreds of them, arranged in their combat boxes. And above them, the fighter escort P-51s, most likely, though they were still too far away to identify positively. "All aircraft, combat power," Richter ordered, advancing his throttle and feeling the familiar surge of acceleration. Around him, 27 other FW-190s did the same, their formations tightening, canopies gliding shut, gun sights being switched on. This was the moment he lived for, the calm before the storm, the world reduced to the simple, clean geometry of aerial combat. But something was wrong. As they closed the distance, Richter's experienced eyes began picking up details that didn't fit the intelligence briefings. The escort fighters weren't just the expected P-51s. There were other aircraft mixed in, larger, with distinctive elliptical wings and massive radial engines. P-47s. But they were flying much higher than Thunderbolts usually operated, holding formation with the Mustangs at 28,000 feet with apparent ease. "Blue leader, this is Yellow One," Richter called to Schmidt. "I'm seeing Thunderbolts in the high escort. Repeat, Thunderbolts at 28,000. There was a moment of static, then Schmidt's calm voice. "Confirmed, Yellow One. They must be using maximum power to maintain that altitude. They'll be sitting ducks once they start maneuvering." Richter wasn't so sure. Through his binoculars, the Thunderbolts didn't look like they were struggling. They held tight formation, their contrails straight and steady. And there were more of them than he'd ever seen in one place. Not the dozen or so typically assigned to close escort, but dozens, perhaps over 100. The first indication that this would be no ordinary engagement came at 9:44. The German formation was still climbing, positioning for a textbook attack on the bomber stream from above and ahead, when the high escort suddenly broke away and began diving toward them. Not just the P-51s. The Thunderbolts were diving too, and they weren't lumbering down in the slow, predictable arcs Richter had come to expect. They were falling out of the sky like stones, accelerating with shocking rapidity. "Brake left, someone shouted over the radio. The calm professionalism of moments before evaporated into sudden, sharp urgency. Richter banked hard, his body pressing into the seat as centrifugal force took hold. Through the top of his canopy, he watched the diving American fighters grow from specks to distinct shapes with terrifying speed. They weren't just diving. They were maneuvering during their dive, maintaining formation, coordinating their attack in a way he'd never seen from Thunderbolt pilots before. The first pass was a blur of motion and noise. A P-47 flashed past Richter's canopy so close he could see the individual rivets on its wings, the .850 caliber machine guns in its wings suddenly sparkling with orange flame. The sound was like ripping canvas magnified 1,000 times. To his left, one of the FW-190 staggered, pieces flying off its wing root. The pilot didn't even have time to radio a mayday before the aircraft rolled onto its back and began spinning down toward the earth. "Yellow 2 on me," Richter barked, pulling into a climbing turn to try to regain altitude advantage. For a moment there was no response. "Vogel, respond." Then a strained, breathless voice. "Still with you, Herr Oberleutnant." That was closer than I'd like. Richter risked a quick glance around. The sky, which had been orderly moments before, had dissolved into chaos. Dozens of individual dogfights swirled around him, the neat German formations shattered by the unexpected ferocity and coordination of the American attack. And the Thunderbolts, they weren't behaving like Thunderbolts. They were turning tighter, climbing faster, and most shockingly, they were following the German fighters through maneuvers that should have left the heavier American aircraft wallowing helplessly in their wake. One of them latched onto the tail of a FW-190 from Green Flight. The German pilot, an experienced Oberfeldwebel with over 30 victories, executed a classic break, a hard, high-G turn that should have forced the heavier Thunderbolt to overshoot. Instead, the P-47 turned with him, staying glued to his 6 o'clock position. Richter watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the Americans' 8 machine guns spoke again. The FW-190 came apart in midair, its fuel tanks igniting in a brilliant orange fireball. "Impossible," Richter heard himself whisper. The Thunderbolt shouldn't have been able to turn that tightly, not at that speed, not at this altitude. It defied everything he knew about aircraft performance, everything he'd been taught about American fighters. The radio was becoming a cacophony of confused, increasingly desperate voices. "They're everywhere. I can't shake him. Where did they all come from? These aren't normal Thunderbolts." Richter pulled his aircraft into a steep climb, trying to get above the fray where he could assess the situation. What he saw made his blood run cold. The American fighters weren't just the initial high escort he'd seen. More waves were arriving, stacking up at different altitudes, creating a layered defense that made any coordinated attack on the bombers impossible. And the Thunderbolts, there were so many of them. Not the handful intelligence had predicted, but what looked like entire groups, over 100 aircraft at least. Worse, they were flying with a coordination he'd never witnessed before. Instead of the individualistic, almost knightly combat style of German aces, the Americans fought as teams. When one Thunderbolt engaged, two others covered him. When a German pilot tried to exploit what should have been an advantage, another American fighter would appear from an unexpected direction, forcing him to break off. It was like fighting a hydra. For every German advantage, two American counters appeared. Vogel's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with panic. "Herr Oberleutnant, two on my tail, I can't. They're too fast." Richter rolled inverted, pulling through into a dive that pressed him into his seat with crushing force. Below him, he saw Vogel's FW-190 twisting desperately. Two P-47s following his every move with what seemed like effortless precision. They weren't just faster in a dive, they were matching him turn for turn, their performance completely unlike the sluggish Thunderbolts Richter had fought so many times before. "Break right and dive, Vogel. I'm coming." But even as he spoke, he saw the telltale flashes from the leading Thunderbolt's wings. Tracers reached out, walking toward Vogel's aircraft. The young pilot jinked left, then right, but the American stayed with him, the range closing relentlessly. The second P-47 hung back slightly, covering its leader's tail, a perfect demonstration of the teamwork that was making the German pilots' lives so difficult. Richter pushed his throttle to the emergency war power setting, feeling the BMW engine roar its protest. He had to get there, had to distract the Americans long enough for Vogel to escape. But the distance was too great, the angles all wrong. He was still 2,000 feet above and behind when the Thunderbolt's guns found their mark. Vogel's aircraft shuddered as the .50 caliber rounds tore into its wing root and fuselage. A piece of the left wing tore away, then the canopy flew off as the young pilot attempted to bail out. Richter watched, helpless, as Vogel's body tumbled from the cockpit, his parachute streaming but not deploying properly. The FW-190 continued its death plunge, smoke pouring from its engine, until it disappeared into the cloud layer below. The two Thunderbolts that had killed his wingman didn't linger to watch their handiwork. They immediately broke in opposite directions, climbing back toward altitude to rejoin the fight. No triumphant rolls, no circling the parachute, just businesslike, efficient killing. Richter felt a cold fury building in his chest, mixed with something else, something he rarely experienced: fear. He wasn't just fighting better aircraft or more numerous enemies. He was fighting a system, a methodology of war that was fundamentally different from anything the Luftwaffe had prepared for. The Americans weren't relying on individual heroism or technical superiority in any one area. They had created a machine where adequate aircraft in overwhelming numbers, flown by adequately trained pilots using superior tactics, could defeat smaller numbers of excellent aircraft flown by experts. The realization was like a physical blow. All the assumptions he'd built his career on, all the certainties that had sustained him through 3 years of air combat, were crumbling around him. The FW-190 was indeed a magnificent aircraft, perhaps the best fighter in the world on a one-to-one basis. But wars aren't one-to-one. They're won by the side that can put more aircraft in the air, more often, with better coordination. For the next 20 minutes, the battle swirled across 50 miles of sky, a sprawling, chaotic melee that saw the outnumbered Germans gradually worn down by the relentless American pressure. Richter himself claimed 2 Thunderbolts in the fighting, but each victory felt harder won, each escape narrower than the last. The Americans were learning, adapting, improving even as the battle raged. Their initial passes had been somewhat ragged, their shooting inaccurate at longer ranges. But as the engagement continued, their coordination improved, their marksmanship sharpened. It was as if they were using the combat as training, becoming more deadly with each passing minute. By 10:15, the German formation was in tatters. Of the 28 FW-190s that had taken off from Juvincourt, Richter could account for only 14 still in the fight. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have lost few if any of their number, and more kept arriving, fresh aircraft cycling in to replace those low on fuel or ammunition. The numerical disparity was becoming absurd, the tactical situation hopeless. "All aircraft, this is Blue Leader," Schmidt's voice came through, strained but calm. "Break off and return to base. Repeat, break off and return to base. Rendezvous point Charlie." The relief in the radio acknowledgments was palpable. One by one, the remaining FW-190s disengaged, using their superior diving speed to escape the slower climbing Thunderbolts. It was a standard German tactic, one that had saved countless pilots over the years. Dive away, build up speed, extend out of range before the enemy could bring their guns to bear. Richter put his own aircraft into a steep dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb past 450, then 500, then 550 km/h. The FW-190 was in its element now, the sleek airframe slicing through the thickening air, the BMW engine screaming at full power. Behind him, he expected to see the Thunderbolts giving up the chase, their inferior diving performance leaving them wallowing in his wake as they always did. But when he risked a glance over his shoulder, what he saw made his blood run cold. Not one, but 4 P-47s were diving with him, and they weren't falling behind. They were keeping pace, their own airspeed building, their massive radial engines propelling them downward with shocking velocity. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Thunderbolt was heavy, draggy. It should have been left behind in a dive. Every pilot knew that. Every tactical manual stated it as fact. Yet there they were, 4 dark shapes growing steadily larger in his mirror, their 8-gun wings beginning to sparkle with the first tentative bursts of gunfire. Richter pushed the stick forward, steepening his dive still further, the airframe beginning to buffet as he approached the red line. 600 km/h 650. The earth was rushing up to meet him, the details of fields and roads and villages becoming terrifyingly distinct. Still the Thunderbolts followed, matching him move for move, their performance completely at odds with everything he'd been taught about American fighters. In that moment, with the wind screaming past his canopy and 4 determined enemies closing in from behind, Klaus Richter understood with chilling clarity that the rules had changed. The comfortable certainties of German aerial supremacy, the tactical doctrines he'd built his career upon, the very foundation of his understanding of air combat, all of it was wrong. Dangerously, catastrophically wrong. And as the first 50 caliber rounds began tearing into his left wing, he realized with dawning horror that he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The first 50 caliber rounds tore through the left wing of Richter's Focke-Wulf with a sound like a giant ripping sheet of canvas. Not the sporadic pop-pop-pop of cannon fire he was used to, but a sustained, brutal hammering. The aircraft shuddered violently, the control stick jerking in his hand. A constellation of holes appeared in the wing's leading edge, and a stream of fuel began to vaporize into a fine, white mist behind him. The smell of raw gasoline and cordite seeped into the cockpit, acrid and terrifying. His mind, trained by 100 combats, raced through the options that no longer existed. A climbing turn. The Thunderbolts would match it. A tighter spiral. They were already turning with him. A dive to the deck. They were still there, their dark, hulking shapes filling his mirror, growing larger by the second. The foundational tactics of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, the sacred text of the expert, had been rendered obsolete in the space of a single morning. He hauled back on the stick, the G-forces pressing him down into his seat, his vision tunneling to a gray pinprick. He was trying to pull out of the dive, to trade his terrifying speed for altitude. The FW-190 groaned in protest, the airframe straining against forces it was never designed to sustain. The four P-47s followed him through the maneuver without breaking formation, their pursuit as methodical and relentless as a machine press. One of them, its pilot seeing the fuel stream, fired a short, aimed burst. Tracers arced past his canopy, not the wild spraying of a novice, but the disciplined fire of a pilot who knew his aircraft's ballistics intimately. A new sound joined the symphony of destruction, a deep, resonant thump-thump-thump as rounds slammed into the fuselage behind his seat. Something hot and sharp stung his neck, a sliver of plexiglass or metal. The instrument panel exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. The altimeter needle spun wildly. The airspeed indicator froze, then dropped to zero. The BMW engine, until now a reliable roar, began to cough and sputter, its rhythm faltering as a bullet found some vital component in the cooling system. A wave of heat washed over his boots. Fire. Yellow 1, I'm hit. Engine fire, he yelled into the radio, but the only response was the hiss of static. The antenna had been shot away. There was no time for fear, only a cold, procedural finality. He had to get out. The memory of Vogel's tumbling body, his parachute a useless streamer, flashed before his eyes. He released the canopy latch. The howling wind tore the perspex hood away in an instant, the sudden decompression sucking maps and charts from the cockpit. The slipstream was a physical wall, pinning him to his seat. He fought against it, unbuckling his harness with one hand while wrestling the stick with the other, trying to keep the stricken aircraft level for just a few more seconds. He pulled the nose up slightly, bleeding off more speed, then kicked the rudder hard left. The FW-190 snapped into a spin, a final, desperate maneuver to throw off his pursuers. It worked for a moment. The four Thunderbolts overshot, their pilots disciplined enough not to follow a spinning target into an uncontrollable dive. Through a blur of earth and sky, Richter saw his chance. He hauled himself up, the wind tearing at his flight jacket, and threw himself into the void. The world became a violent, tumbling chaos. The ground, the sky, the burning wreck of his aircraft spun around him in a dizzying carousel. The force of the ejection ripped the oxygen mask from his face and tore his gloves from his hands. He counted, the numbers a desperate mantra in his head. 1,000, 2,000. His hand found the D-ring on his chest. He pulled. The jerk was so violent he thought his legs had been torn off. Then, blessed silence. The screaming wind was gone, replaced by a gentle, swaying peace. He was floating. Above him, the white silk of the parachute billowed like a blessing. Below, his FW-190 continued its death spiral. A comet of smoke and flame until it plunged into a wooded hillside and erupted in a silent, orange flower of fire. The four P-47s circled once, a victory lap, then turned their noses westward and disappeared, their mission accomplished. There was no machine gunning of the parachute, no gloating rolls. It was over. He drifted down into a world of startling quiet. The roar of engines, the rattle of guns, the frantic voices on the radio, all were gone. He could hear the wind rustling the bare branches of the trees below, the distant lowing of a cow. He landed awkwardly in a frozen pasture, the impact jarring his teeth. He collapsed the chute, his hands shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline shock of what had just happened. He was alive. He was on the ground. And he was, for the first time in his life, utterly defeated. He looked at his watch. It was 10:23. The entire engagement, from the first diving attack to his own shoot-down, had lasted less than 40 minutes. In that time, his understanding of aerial warfare had been dismantled. As he gathered his parachute, his eyes scanned the sky. It was empty. Of the 28 FW-190s that had taken off from Juvincourt, he could see none. The sky belonged to the contrails of the victorious American bombers, now proceeding unmolested toward their targets deep inside Germany. The scale of the defeat was not an isolated incident confined to the cold air over northern France on November 7, 1944. It was a single, bloody data point in a catastrophic trend that was eviscerating the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. In the first 6 weeks following the full introduction of the new P-47s with paddle blade propellers and water injection, the Jagdflieger in the West would lose 342 fighter aircraft. The kill-to-loss ratio, once a comfortable 1.2 to 1 in favor of the Germans, had inverted to a devastating 4.7 to 1 against them. On that single day, the USAAF would report the loss of 21 heavy bombers and 11 fighters. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, lost 68 aircraft shot down, with 43 pilots killed or missing. It was a rate of attrition that was mathematically unsustainable. While Richter was stumbling through a French field, 100 miles to the east, another drama was unfolding that underscored the systematic nature of the German collapse. At the Luftwaffe's Central Evaluation Center at Richlin, a team of engineers and intelligence officers was gathered around the mangled wreckage of a P-47D that had been shot down near Aachen the previous week and painstakingly transported for analysis. The aircraft was a revelation. Hauptingenieur Wolf, a man who had devoted his life to German aviation, ran a hand over the broad, curved blade of the propeller. "It's so simple," he murmured to his assistant, a young lieutenant who still believed in the myth of Wunderwaffen. "We were looking for miracles in jet turbines and rocket engines. They found it in a new shape for a propeller." The lieutenant pointed to the massive R-2800 engine, its 18 cylinders a testament to raw power. "But the weight, Herr Hauptingenieur, it must be enormous. How can it perform like our pilots are reporting?" Wolf picked up a clipboard. "That's the other part of the equation, water injection. They are injecting a water-alcohol mixture directly into the supercharger. It cools the intake charge, allows for massive boost pressure increases without detonation." He shook his head, a reluctant admiration on his face. "For 5, maybe 10 minutes, this aircraft can produce over 23 horsepower, more than double our BMW 801. Our pilots are not engaging the same aircraft they fought a year ago. They are engaging a new weapon, and our intelligence has failed to warn them." The report Wolf would file later that day would be marked Geheim Secret and would contain chillingly accurate assessments. It noted the P-47's devastating roll rate, its ability to dive with anything in the German inventory, and its newfound agility at medium and high altitudes. It concluded, "The tactical advantage enjoyed by the FW-190 and BF-109, particularly in the initial attack and disengagement phases, has been nullified. Encounters should be avoided unless numerical superiority is guaranteed." The report was circulated to the offices of the General der Jagdflieger. It was read, annotated, and filed away. The bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich, already choking on its own complexities and the delusional optimism of its leadership, was incapable of the rapid, radical adaptation required. This institutional paralysis was mirrored in the cockpit of every surviving German pilot. As Richter was eventually picked up by a German army patrol and driven back to Juvincourt, he passed a column of panzers. He saw the faces of the tank crews, looking up at the sky, which was once again filled with the droning of American bombers on their return flight. There were no German fighters in sight to harass them. The soldiers' faces were not angry, but resigned. The ceiling of steel that the Luftwaffe had once provided had been torn away. He arrived back at Juvincourt just after 14 o'clock. The airfield was a morgue. The morning's confident buzz was gone, replaced by a hollow, stunned silence. Of the 28 aircraft that had departed, only 9 had returned. 2 of those were so badly damaged they would never fly again. The ground crews moved slowly, their faces ashen. They were not just servicing machines. They were collecting the personal effects of men who were now gone. Hauptmann Schmidt, the Gruppe Kommandeur, stood outside the operations hut, his flight jacket unzipped, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes were red-rimmed and distant. He saw Richter and gave a slow, weary nod. "Klaus, good to see you." The words were automatic, devoid of emotion. "Herr Hauptmann," Richter said, his voice rough. "The reports are a catastrophe," Schmidt finished for him. He took a long drag on his cigarette. "The entire mission was a disaster, not just us. Aye. Grupp from St. Dizier lost 12 aircraft. The Americans, they were waiting for us. It was a trap. Their fighters were stacked in layers. We never even got close to the bombers." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a lone mechanic trying to patch the shredded wing of a FW-190. The effort seemed futile. "They have new propellers," Richter said quietly. "Their Thunderbolts can dive with us. They can turn with us at altitude." Schmidt nodded again, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "I know, I saw it too. Oberleutnant Fischer from Green Flight swears a P-47 outturned him at 6,000 meters. I would have called him a liar this morning." He dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "There is a briefing at 1600. The wing commander is flying in. He wants answers." The briefing room that afternoon was a portrait of a military elite confronting its own irrelevance. The walls were still adorned with maps marked with confident arrows and optimistic frontline positions, but the air was thick with the smell of sweat, defeat, and stale coffee. Oberst von Strade, the wing commander, stood before them, his jaw tight. He listened as each surviving flight leader recounted his experience. The stories were all variations on the same theme: unexpected performance, overwhelming numbers, and a terrifying new level of American coordination. "It is a matter of tactics," von Strade insisted, slamming his hand on the table. "We must adapt, use the Sturmbach formations more aggressively, get in close, hit the bombers hard, and get out." A veteran major, his face scarred from a crash landing, spoke up, his voice laced with a bitterness born of experience. "Herr Oberst, with all respect, the Sturmbach aircraft are heavy, slow, and vulnerable. They are bomber killers. Against these new escorts, they are death traps. We cannot get to the bombers. The escorts engage us 30 minutes before we even reach them. They have the fuel to loiter and the performance to fight us on equal terms." Another pilot, a young Oberleutnant with a bandage on his forehead, added, "They fight in teams of 4. When you engage one, 2 others are already diving on you. They don't care about individual duels. It is like fighting an assembly line." The word hung in the air, assembly line. It was the core of the problem, a concept alien to the German warrior ethos. While German aces like Richter were celebrated as individual knights of the sky, the American system was designed to produce not knights, but competent components in a vast, unstoppable machine. This truth was being driven home with sledgehammer force in other theaters simultaneously. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, a similar revolution was underway. On the very same day Richter was shot down, a young Japanese naval ace, Lieutenant Commander Jiro Sato of the 201st Air Group, was experiencing his own moment of terrifying revelation over the Philippines. Leading a formation of agile A-6 million Zero fighters against a U.S. Navy task force, he watched in disbelief as a new American fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, not only matched his legendary Zero's turn rate but outdove, outrolled, and outgunned it. The Hellcat, another product of America's industrial and scientific might, had been specifically designed to counter the Zero's strengths. Sato, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, would write in his diary that night before his death, "The enemy has created a fighter that has stolen our soul. Our agility is gone. Our empire is defended by ghosts against machines." Back in Europe, the perspective from the highest levels of command was one of growing panic mixed with denial. In the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler was presented with the preliminary loss figures from the day's air battles. He flew into a rage, dismissing the reports as defeatist nonsense and blaming the Luftwaffe's leadership for a lack of aggressive spirit. Hermann Göring, desperate to regain favor, issued impossible orders. Pilots were to stay and fight, regardless of the odds. Fighters were to ram the bombers if necessary. These orders, disconnected from the reality of the air war, only served to accelerate the loss of the Luftwaffe's most valuable asset, its experienced pilots. The human cost was becoming a hemorrhage. In the 6 months between November 1944 and April 1945, the Luftwaffe would lose over 2,000 fighter pilots killed in action in the West alone. The training pipeline, crippled by fuel shortages and bombed-out facilities, could only replace them with boys who had barely 50 hours of flight time. These replacements were sent into combat against American pilots who had logged 300 hours or more before ever seeing an enemy. The average life expectancy of a new German pilot in the West plummeted to a matter of weeks, then days. Richter experienced this brutal calculus firsthand in the weeks that followed. He was promoted to Hauptmann and given command of his own staffel. His veterans were pilots with a handful of missions. His new wingman was a 17-year-old named Becker, whose hands shook so badly he could barely light his cigarette. They flew older, patched-together FW-190A8s, their engines tired, their cannons often jammed. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have an endless supply of new aircraft and fresh, confident pilots. On a mission in early December, Richter's staffel of 12 aircraft was bounced by a full group of over 50 P-47s. The fight was not a battle, it was a slaughter. He watched his new pilots, trained on obsolete tactics, try to turn with the Thunderbolts and be shredded. Becker, in a panic, froze at his controls and was shot out of the sky without ever firing a shot. Richter managed to disengage by diving to treetop level and running at full throttle, the American fighters finally breaking off as they neared their fuel limits. He returned to base alone. His staffel had been wiped out in 4 minutes. The war diary entry for his grup that day read simply, 12 aircraft dispatched, 1 returned, 11 pilots missing, enemy losses, 0 confirmed. The strategic impact of this aerial carnage was immediate and total. With the Luftwaffe fighter arm effectively neutralized, the Allies achieved total air supremacy over Western Europe. This single fact made Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, possible and ultimately successful. It allowed Allied ground forces to maneuver without fear of aerial attack, while German movements were constantly harassed and destroyed by marauding jabos. The once proud panzer divisions became prisoners of the weather, able to move only under cover of darkness or poor visibility. The supply lines of the German army were severed, their fuel depots bombed into smoking craters, their railroads turned into twisted steel spaghetti. The collapse of morale was as complete as the military defeat. In the bars and mess halls, the talk was no longer of victory, but of survival. Pilots who had once boasted of their kill counts now spoke in hushed tones about the best way to belly land a damaged aircraft or how to avoid being sent on a Himmelfahrtskommando, a suicide mission. The deep-seated cultural prejudice that had once dismissed American pilots as bus drivers was replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. They were not flamboyant, but they were lethally efficient. They were not aces, but they were a system. And the system was grinding the Luftwaffe into dust. This system's terrifying efficiency was glimpsed by the few German prisoners of war who were transported through the United States. One such POW, Lieutenant Karl Müller, a bomber pilot shot down in 1943, kept a secret diary during his captivity. While being moved between camps in 1944, his train passed the Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan. He stared, dumbfounded, as completed B-24 Liberator bombers rolled out of the factory at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. He wrote that night, "We passed a factory that stretches to the horizon. The Americans are not building aircraft. They are growing them from the earth like wheat. I saw more bombers on that one airfield than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in 1939. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting geology." The final, devastating numbers would only be fully understood after the war. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. The entire German aircraft industry, despite Herculean efforts and the brutal exploitation of slave labor, managed to produce approximately 45,000 fighter aircraft of all types throughout the entire war. In 1944 alone, the year of Richter's defeat, America produced over 25,000 fighter aircraft. Germany produced just over 12,000. The arithmetic was as brutal as it was simple. For every German fighter that took off, there were 2, then 3, then 4 American fighters waiting for it. Quality, no matter how exquisite, could not withstand such overwhelming quantity, especially when that quantity was now of comparable, and in some cases superior, quality. For Klaus Richter, the war ended not with a bang, but with a sputtering whimper. On a cold, gray morning in March 1945, he led his last mission. His Gruppe, now a collection of battered FW-190s and a few desperate Messerschmitt 109s, was ordered to intercept a formation of B-17s heading for Berlin. They never got close. They were intercepted by a wall of P-51 Mustangs, the other half of the American fighter duo that had won the air war. In the ensuing melee, Richter's aircraft was hit in the cooling system. He watched his temperature gauge climb into the red, the engine beginning to seize. He was too low to bail out. He picked a field, a patch of muddy earth between 2 stands of pine trees, and belly-landed the failing fighter. It slid across the frozen ground, tearing off its landing gear and shredding its wings, before coming to a jarring stop. He sat there for a long moment, the only sound the tink-tink-tink of cooling metal and the hiss of steam from the ruptured radiator. He was unhurt. He climbed out, his body aching with a fatigue that was more spiritual than physical. He stood by the wreck of his aircraft, looking up at the contrail-streaked sky. The American bombers droned on, unimpeded, toward the heart of the Reich. He felt no anger, no hatred, only a vast, empty relief. It was over. The struggle against the impossible was finished. An old farmer emerged from a nearby cottage, a pitchfork in his hand. He looked at Richter, then at the swastikas on the tail of the broken plane. He didn't speak. He just shook his head slowly, a gesture of pity and final judgment. Richter unstrapped his pistol and dropped it into the mud. He took off his officer's cap with its gold braid, a symbol of a pride that now felt like a distant, foolish memory, and let it fall beside the pistol. He had flown over 200 combat missions. He had 53 confirmed victories. He was one of the lucky ones, one of the mere 17% of Jagdflieger who had survived from the beginning of the war to its end. He had witnessed the zenith of German air power and had been on the front lines for its utter and complete destruction. He started walking west, towards the advancing American lines, a solitary figure in a field of mud, beneath a sky that no longer belonged to him. The mastery of the air, won through individual brilliance and technical ingenuity, had been irrevocably lost to the relentless, crushing power of a system that could produce, replace, and adapt on a scale he had never been trained to comprehend. The nights were gone. The age of the machine had arrived.